Hi, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us today for a really important discussion is Susan Glasser, staff writer of The New Yorker. Susan, wonderful to have you with us again in this new year. Also joining us is James Harding, the founder and editor of Tortoise Media. James, great to have you back. And Stefan Kornelius, who is the foreign editor of the German daily Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, wonderful to have you as well. Well, I thought we were going to talk about a lot of important issues, Iran, China, the European Union, what is happening around the world, but we really have to talk about what happened in the capital of the United States in the past few days. Visions and scenes we would have never thought possible happened here in Washington. We want to talk about that for the rest of the 45 minutes, the implications for the United States, the implications for relations with our allies, for democracy, how other countries are dealing with it. But let's start with setting the scene, Susan. You're closest, you weren't there, but you're closest to the scene of the action and have already reflected on it. What do you take from the events, and where do you think this leads in terms of the evolving situation here in the United States?
Well, Ivo, thank you so much. It's, in some ways, it couldn't be a more graphic illustration of the crisis of an American democracy to have a mob take over and ransack and rampage through the literal symbol of American democracy, which is the U.S. Capitol around the world, as well as in the United States. And, listening to your opening and this idea that we'd like to talk about the world and, the new geopolitical stage as Vice President Biden prepares to become president. Domestic political crisis of the U.S. To me, that's the story of my last 4 years, really, in many ways, right? Is, wanting always, every week, I would start out writing my New Yorker column and try to, write about Russia or, our policy toward the European and Germany, or and be pulled back into, in the end, by the end of the week, writing about an American democracy very much in crisis and not stable for the first and only time, really, in my lifetime. And I think this was sort of the culmination of that, the visible manifestation of a crisis that has been roiling America for the last 4 years with the presidency of Donald Trump. It's not an outlier event, in fact, but an event that's very consistent with what we've been seeing, even though it's been hard for people to really focus on that. Somebody said to me at the very beginning, literally back in January of 2017, this is Strobe Talbot, at the time still the head of the Brookings Institution. He had been, of course, a senior State Department official, helped to lead the U.S. response to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he told me about getting a visit from a senior Japanese diplomat the very week of Donald Trump's inauguration. They were, trying to talk about what the world would look like during the Trump presidency. But the diplomat said, listen, I'm here because this is the #1 locus of geopolitical instability in the world. What happens here in the American Capitol, that is the only thing that really fundamentally matters right now from my point of view, and that's why I'm here. And I've borne that in mind every day for the last 4 years. And so, I just on a personal note, it really broke my heart to see this happen in the U.S. Capitol. I started my career as a journalist on Capitol Hill. I spent 8 years as a writer and editor, and then the editor of a local newspaper, sort of before the internet era, when it really was sort of the Politico of its time. And this building is it plays a crucial role in and of itself in our democracy. And see so many of these rioters, to see them walking in amazement and awe through Statuary Hall with the haze of tear gas lingering around them, realizing they'd never been in this building that they chose to storm and to desecrate. They're ignorance was so monumental, and yet the destruction they were wreaking upon the system had no idea how it works. To me, it was the juxtaposition of those two things that tells you so much about the moment. And that, you know, there are talks of entitlement. There will be commissions and investigations for years to understand exactly, probably minute by minute, what happened, since they were all there filming this on their social media streams. They were live streaming the insurrection, as it were. You know, so I'll leave you with those thoughts, but I do think that profoundly, you know, what we witnessed was a violation this week. It was a defilement, but it was also probably literally the live televised version of the death of American exceptionalism, the idea that an American foreign policy in the future can lecture other countries in any way about democracy and, you know, what their system should be when our own is in such a profound crisis, is very hard. And I think, therefore, it has enormous international as well as domestic implications.
James, you reported from Washington when you were with the Financial Times. It's when you and I met a long time ago. When you were watching the pictures and seeing what was going on, what was your reaction to, I mean, I think the basic question is American democracy teetering at the brink, or is this just a hiccup in a long story of American history where we've had challenges to the system, but it will survive, which is something that President Macron said the other day. How did you react to this? And remind you, you're on mute still.
Well, the first thing to say is I'm very affected by what Susan just said. I'm very affected by it. Broke my heart, right? Because the reality is there was a whole range of feelings rather than judgments that you had watching it roll out. You know, I felt honestly frightened. I was really frightened that there would be real bloodshed on the steps of the Capitol and what that would mean for the world. I was incredibly sad, right? I thought this building, anyone who's been to Washington has taken that walk along the mile or stood, you know, at the Lincoln Memorial and looked at the sunlight as it hits that building. It's inspiring. I felt also, honestly, vindicated and angry. You know, those feelings that you had that said the narcissism in the Oval Office will tend towards vandalism, right? That ultimately something dangerous comes of this. You've been saying it for some time, and there it was proof. It was unarguable. And angry, I have to say, at those people who aided and abetted. It was those people, I have to say, and it's a long list, overwhelmingly in the Republican Party, putting aside those people who stood up to the president, who've enabled that to have a political momentum of its own. But I just wanted to pick up on Susan's other phrase, the death of American exceptionalism, right? Because people like me who love America and believe in it because it's a country that, for all its incredible flaws, is a country rooted in the pursuit of a set of ideals. And the reason that you don't want to see the death of American exceptionalism is because if it dies in America, it has real knock-on effects on those ideals in the rest of the world. And so I was trying to think if there's anything sensible you can say from this distance. And I had only three thoughts. One was, I really hope that America pursues these criminal acts. They are criminal acts, up to and including the President of the United States, because that will be an assertion of the rule of law. I really hope that the Republican Party internalizes what parties need to internalize when they lose, right? The Republican Party has lost across the board. Let's not forget what happened in Georgia. And what you need to do when you lose is not ask, what's the problem with you, the electorate? It's what's the problem with us, right? And a real rethinking of what's happening in the right will do a lot to restore that American exceptionalism. And then I think there is a sort of note to self, I have to say, from this, which is about, I sort of call it sort of hillbilly elegyitis, in which, you know, post 2016, there was a lot of thinking, particularly amongst quote unquote liberal elites, that, you know, you'd got it wrong, that you had to be, you know, careful in the criticism of this populism. In the UK, for example, I was at the BBC at the time, there was a debate even about the use of the word populism, right? That populism was pejorative and patronizing towards a popular political movement. Actually, what we saw this week was the logical extension of populism, which was when a demagogue thinks the rules don't apply to him, it's extremely dangerous for democracy, and it was extremely dangerous for the rest of the world. And so for me, I think there is, exactly as you said at the top, Ivo, a requirement here to call out the small infractions of populism around the world, because we can see now that they lead to very, very big ones.
Really important points, James, and we'll get back to all of them. But let me give Stefan an opportunity. You were watching this from Berlin. We were talking about doing the show on Tuesday, and like I said for the hour, we thought we were going to talk about Russian hacking and the China-EU agreement on investment and the Biden new foreign policy team, et cetera. And you piped in, and this is on Tuesday. Well, don't we want to talk about what's happening in the United States and what impact that has on foreign policy? No one, including you, I don't think we're thinking about the storming of the Capitol the next day, but you were already concerned about what was happening in the country and what it meant. So how do you take that reflection now that you saw, as James and Susan put it, the logical culmination of that happening with the storming of the Capitol? And you're still on mute as well, Stefan.
Well, we were all concerned, but not because we knew that would happen, but because we knew that Wednesday would be the natural culmination point to an awful 4 years, and that everything we saw, all those breakings of rules and laws and habits and whatever made American democracy strong, came to a final high point. And the only question was, how bad would it be? And but nobody really expected this man to leave just quietly or without a bang. Now here we got what we feared, and well, to answer the question about the hiccup. This is not a hiccup. This is a very continuation of not only 4 years of American politics, but even longer. Since you all share memories of that wonderful building, I do remember roaming those halls in the 90s as a correspondent during the second Clinton presidency, which was the impeachment moment. And this was when all that hatred, all that ferocity came into politics and was so graspable. And I always thought, this is a joke, this is not real, this can't be serious, but it was deadly serious. And after that, in 2000, we saw the fight over the result, and things continued from there on. And the kind of openness, the kind of freedom I perceived or I felt with that building, just walking in as an ordinary foreign journalist, well, with all credentials, but you simply walked through the halls and never came back. To me now, the two essential points are will that be a moment where the rule of law will be upheld? It is an extremely important watershed now, where you actually have to prove as a society, as a democracy, that the rule of law is supreme. And I actually, after not even 48 hours, cannot honestly see this happening. Police, investigators, whoever is in charge, is taking extremely time in pursuing these things. It was actually frustrating to see those lunatics walk in and out cheering and without not being hindered at doing so. But it's sort of in the making, and I think there are still a lot of reasonable people out there who do understand that they have to act now to uphold and be credible on the rule of law issue. It definitely is the moment. This is probably the positive aspect I want to bring in this debate. It's the moment where a majority in the country could understand that those rules and laws are higher and are more important than just one man. And so as a practical aspect, I mean, if anything but that storming of the mob will not give us a clear moment to decide which side we're on, then I'm lost. I really could not tell you whether America would play a role in the world anymore if that isn't a moment where you have to decide which side you're on. And it's not that difficult. So I'm surprised that so many members of parliament, so many congressmen and women couldn't make up their mind. As I do understand the tactical objections to an impeachment and the implications, I know that this is going to be difficult. On the clear legal side, it is not too much to ask to condemn what's happened.
Susan, you raised the issue of American exceptionalism, and our two foreign guests have both reaffirmed the importance of American exceptionalism. I'm an immigrant. I came to this country because of American exceptionalism in its most profound way, and linked in both senses to the rule of law as sort of the foundational aspect. And I would argue next to it, this issue of democracy, one vote, one person, one vote, and the one with the most votes wins. And that is a foundational aspect of American exceptionalism, both about who we are at home, the city up the hill, and John Winthrop, and what example we set to the rest of the world as a means to that end. When you look at what is the debate in Washington today and going and project it forward, how strong do you think the rule of law is going to be, and come back to all of the issues that we have with the perpetrators, with the role of the president, with the issue of pardons or none that are out there? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I think this is exactly where, and rightfully so, the conversation has shifted very quickly to this set of questions for exactly the reasons that, Stefan, I think your points are extremely important right now. And so one thing I would say is, in a disturbing sense, the initial polling suggests that not only do Republicans continue in shocking numbers to believe in the big lie foisted upon them by Donald Trump in terms of the legitimacy of the election, the numbers before the attack on the Capitol were something close to 80% of Republicans believe, without foundation in the baseless claims of their leader, that there was something questionable about the election, when in fact it actually wasn't even a very close election, as Mitch McConnell himself pointed out the other day. So that's one bucket, right? The delegitimization of the election itself, and therefore of our new president, Joe Biden, that is still hanging out there. Number two, initial polls suggest there's a shockingly high level of support among Republicans, even for this horrific, violent act of attacking the Capitol. Something around 20% of Americans, and an even higher percentage of Republicans, basically supported it, did not think there was anything wrong with what happened the other day that was so profoundly and manifestly wrong. So there's basically a disturbingly large chunk of the American population that approves of these illegal and violent acts. And so that's very, very scary from the point of view of our internal politics and from the point of view of our role in the world. Third,
Susan, just on to like your point on the poll. So YouGov did a poll immediately after the events, and more Republicans supported the storming than were opposed to it. It was split 45-43. But that is how strong and divided that party is on this essential issue, just as a piece of data.
I think there's another poll that has a somewhat lower number, but it's still way too high, whatever the number is, right? Clearly what we're picking up here is that the instant reaction of a very high percentage of Republicans, which should be zero, saying that it's okay. And then the third thing that's related to this question of, is America still a rule of law country, is the question of the behavior of the Republican members of Congress. And that's where the fact that 140 almost House members and 7 United States senators, after their own building was attacked, after they themselves were in physical jeopardy from a rampaging mob, chose to go along with what I believe history will regard as an unconstitutional coup attempt. Adam Schiff, who led the first unsuccessful impeachment of Donald Trump, he put out a very interesting statement this morning as sort of recounting his own experiences during the mob on Wednesday and Thursday. And he said, you know, and I think it's a really important point, that the coup attempt was not just by the rampaging, you know, like people wielding bats and, you know, like hitting statues and, you know, sitting at Nancy Pelosi's desk and rifling through papers. It was by people in suits and ties who enabled them. It was Republican members of Congress participating in an attack on our constitutional system and inciting that attack, as well as, you know, it's easy to look down on people, you know, like wearing funny hats and, you know, wielding baseball bats against policemen, right? But that the more dangerous and insidious part of this is the fact that it was supported by the majority of Republicans in Congress. And I think that's harder for us to deal with. And that's the part, that's the serious part.
Yeah, James, pick that up there. And I also want to sort of...
I would ask really a question for you, Ivo, and for Susan, which is, I'm interested in what happens from January the 21st. Right? Assuming that the political dynamics don't deliver an impeachment, assuming there's not a Nixon resignation, clearly there's not going to be one of those. The question I've got is really to Stefan's point, which is, what happens now in terms of arrests and prosecutions, and the reason I'm intrigued to know the process of it. The politics of it as regards Biden pulling the country together, but I'm also intrigued, practically speaking, what can you do to a former president through the courts of law as regards these cases?
Well, these are good questions. So I do believe that it's extremely important, and that's why you've heard this strong message from the FBI that we will be hunting down and arresting these people. And of course, there is voluminous evidence because of the stupidity of their actions and, you know, live streaming their quote unquote revolution. And so, you know, so far the numbers are so low. I mean, it really, that's the thing that's just painful again as a citizen to realize that we literally beat the heads of peaceful people who are demanding racial justice in this country. And these mobsters walked out applauding themselves and walked right past police who had the ability to, you know, restrain them and to, you know, hold them for arrest and didn't do a damn thing. And, you know, that is very painful. They've only arrested, as of this moment, 86 people. You know, they've begun to charge them. And I believe that they will arrest more. And in fact, what's really scary is that some of the people who were brought into court yesterday and charged had loaded weapons. They had magazines full of ammunition with them inside the Capitol. You know, you've probably seen the very terrifying, from my point of view, pictures of some of these marauders who were carrying with them plastic rope ties. It looked like they were coming potentially to take hostages or to do something to members of Congress that they found. Again, this is lawlessness on an epic scale. I believe they will be arrested. They've already announced not only a bipartisan investigation, but they fired the House Senate and Sergeant at Arms. They fired the Senate Sergeant at Arms. They fired the Capitol Police Chief. So all of the three leaders who were directly responsible have been fired. Obviously, that was an appropriate thing. There will be, they just announced this morning, a major bipartisan investigation in Congress of, you know, the security failures. That obviously is also appropriate. I think that these trials will take place and hopefully they'll be televised. Hopefully, you know, they will get enormous attention. Unfortunately, the death toll is now up to 5 people, and that includes a U.S. Capitol Police officer, 42 years old. They announced this morning that there will be a murder investigation, a federal murder investigation. That is a capital crime in the United States to murder a federal police law enforcement officer. We don't know, but there could well be video evidence. He was apparently beaten to death by a fire extinguisher wielded by one or several of these attackers. So,
you know, Susan, if I can jump in for a sec, if we look at all of this, for me, the most pressing question is, how can we create, or how can the next president create, the society create some sort of common assumption on what is right and what is wrong? Where is sort of the common base the society will operate from over the next years? Because as long as people are afraid to prosecute or to go after Donald Trump or to sort of tell the truth and speak the truth, and honestly, from all of those 100-something Republican members of Congress who do not speak out, most of them do for cowardness, because they're afraid of the bloody voters out there. So as long as people are not actually consenting on a joint factual base, this country will continue to be torn apart. And I don't know, somebody has to walk out and tell the society that democracy lives from consensus and lives from compromise and not from divisiveness. And this is a message actually which hasn't been brought over the past 4 years. And now we're basically back on square one as we were 4 years ago when Donald Trump was taking over, and looking at that country and not really understanding what's happening there. And it hasn't changed a bit.
I just want to make one point on the joint factual basis, right? I do think we have to call something out, which we can do something about. Because one of the things here is you just feel helpless. One thing we can do is we can call out the fact that the system of information in free societies is not working, right? And at the end of this, you have to stand up and go, it's one thing after the event to block Donald Trump's Twitter feed, right? But if you've got 62% or your data, even Susan is 80% of Republicans believe in the lies, right? It's not working. And I do think that there is something substantial that has to come from this really effectively. And just to say, as someone who doesn't live in the United States, the real problem you've got with the social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter, is that they only really respond. They're global operators, but they only really respond to the politics of the United States. And they don't look at where people abuse the truth in the rest of the world, except in the most haphazard of ways. So I just to your point, Stefan, about kind of joint factual basis, I think is a really key one.
So let me make 2 points and see if we can drive the conversation forward. One is I think a critical question is what happens to Donald J. Trump. And that's the question of whether there is an impeachment procedure or not, whether there is a 25th Amendment movement or not. Even if there is impeachment and there is no conviction and no trial in the Senate, whether you can have that trial after he would leave office on January 20th. And the question raised by the U.S. Attorney in Washington of culpability with regard to the actual actions that occurred on Wednesday and the role that the president has played in that. All of that has to be part of the question of how you rebuild a sense of acceptability and normality. And then I think the second piece, this is the larger piece that both Stefan and James are just pointing out. We need to get back to some sense of what is right and wrong, what is true and not true, what is fact and not fact in the world. And this, by the way, is not something that is just a problem in the United States. It's a huge problem in Europe and in other parts of the world. Where this is happening in whole kinds of ways, and there's a strategy, it seems to me, that all of us need to be part of. But it's not just the social media climate; it is that we have accepted, in some ways, and laughed at, and said, "Oh, these people are just stupid, or they don't know what they're talking about." That doesn't matter. The fact that they believe it means that you need an activist strategy to kind of weigh and deal with that issue. And I don't know we've even started that process. It will matter. And last point on this, it does matter what the president of the United States says. And the contrast between Joe Biden coming out at around 4 p.m. Or 5 p.m. Washington time on Wednesday and calling what he saw by the true name that it was. The contrast, he came in yesterday by saying that if these were Black people, this was Black Lives Matter, that the way the police would have dealt with it was very different to what Donald Trump was doing, suggests that we may have a president starting on January 20 who will call a spade and start the process of healing and bringing people together. But all of us as a community who believe in truth need to be part of the effort to figure out how do you combat disinformation within the social media context, and do so on a global basis, because they're perpetrators of untruth. Are not just here; they're in Russia, they're in China, they're part of the authoritarian ecosystem that exists. We see the consequences in Hong Kong just at the same time that this was happening with regard to democracy. And I think having a democracy and truth and rule of law reinforced by our leaders, not only in the United States, but globally, is something that we all are looking towards. Susan. I mean, so, and I guess what's the role of the United, and I think James is right, certainly the role that we can play in the social media ecosystem, but also, I guess, in the politics to bring this all about.
So look, I think these are really important questions, but there is an urgency. Unfortunately, this isn't a policy discussion right yet, and I don't think it, frankly, to Stefan and James's point, until you have accountability, until you reestablish some basic principles, is not, we can't have a discussion, but the role of platforms and communications policy when we're talking about, does the President of the United States, is he held accountable for attacking our constitutional system? It's worse than inciting violence. Many politicians are irresponsible and demagogues. There were House members who spoke at that rally who incited violence. Perhaps, and some of their colleagues think they should be expelled or censured for having done so. But it's worse, in my view, and therefore more serious, because we're actually talking about a president who attacked the legitimacy of the system itself, right? That's actually worse than inciting people to pick up a club, in my view. And therefore the crimes of those in suits and ties in effect were worse and more serious. So how are we going to establish the rule of law? What is the accountability of the president? Stefan, you've raised this a couple times. I think you're right to hone in on this, because I think this is the part that our political system today is grappling with most seriously. I was just on the phone with someone before this conversation today. I had to get off in order to do this. And he was telling me about the debates that Democrats are having right now over impeachment for this very reason. There's a political question, of course. Do you want to change the subject right now from the President of the United States having incited this terrible violence to a political question about Democratic tactics, right? So that's one issue. But more importantly, there's also the question of, it's a symbolic gesture. Everyone understands that right now, given that there are 11 days left in this presidency. But is it important in reestablishing the principle of accountability? Yesterday, the U.S. attorney announced that they would investigate Trump's own remarks as part of the criminal investigation into the incitement. I thought that was a very important statement. Other former prosecutors have spoken out and said that was extremely important in terms of upholding the rule of law. But in reality, Joe Biden had said before this incident that he was not interested in pursuing a sort of federal investigations of Trump for exactly the reason that he didn't want to undermine American democracy and be seen as imposing a sort of victor's justice on the president. So these are the kinds of questions I think we're going to spend literally every waking moment between now and January 20th debating, because Trump is very likely to pardon himself, which is an unprecedented use of the unlimited power to pardon that is a given to our leaders. No one has ever attempted it, and there is therefore a raging debate among constitutional scholars here in the United States about whether that power actually exists, and if it is exercised, is it legitimate? Would it be challenged? There will be continued speculation, I believe, right up until the very end of the presidency on whether Trump will resign in order to receive a pardon by Mike Pence for that very reason. If Trump is afraid that he could self-pardon and it wouldn't be upheld in court, then he may prefer a pardon by Pence. And, again, I don't have any answers to this, but you can say very clearly that American government is in crisis when these are the questions that we're debating, instead of what kind of communications policy we should have, instead of what kind of approach with Europe we should have toward China. We're not there yet.
So let me try to shift the conversation about from the U.S. to the other parts of the world, because it seems to me whether or not American exceptionalism can be regained, it's going to be a process that it will take a long time, and we've discussed all the reasons for that. And yet, when you are in Germany or you're in UK, as James and Stefan both are, and in other parts of the world where you care about democracy, what is the responsibility now for leaders in Germany, in the European Union, in the UK, in other democracies, to pick up the mantle and to help make sure that what happened in the United States doesn't actually roll over into the rest of the world and sets the wrong example? What positive example can Germany or the EU or London take on these issues, starting in the EU's case, of course, with its own internal problems with Hungary and Poland and other places, with another European country, Turkey, and of course, what's happening in other parts of the world, including Hong Kong, and how one ought to react to that. Is there a way for others to take up the leadership role on the issues of democracy, of human rights, the rule of law, things that bring all of us together, while the United States is sorting out that issue itself? Stefan?
Well, just as a reminder, Angela Merkel years ago was the only leader in the Western world who didn't spring up to congratulate Donald Trump for his election vote, for his win. And she was actually sounding very cautious words and up to it. She now actually repeated it, and in doing so upheld the kind of decency and the kind of standards which we were used to live. Nevertheless, all what happened in the US is reflected already here, or even was hit in Europe before, as you mentioned, Hungary. We saw a mob storming the steps of the German Bundestag, the Reichstag building in Berlin, which is a highly symbolic building, and which was shell-shocking the Germans at that point. That was just a few months ago. Those people were protesting against COVID-19 measures, and they were united with the mob in Washington in their belief that something is wrong with the system, that they were protesting elites, they were protesting those who miraculously seem to govern their life. So we do have those phenomena all over the world. How do we fight them? I think we just have to repeat and repeat and repeat that this is not the norm of democracy, and that democracy works in a different way. I'm not that pessimistic actually about the ability of the US returning as a sort of a leading power and a kind of a beacon in that. I mean, never underestimate the size and the importance of the country. And I fully understand that you now sitting in Washington or in the US are much closer to the events and much more shocked by them. And things do get diffused the further you move away from them. So I think there is a chance that with a very good presidency of Joe Biden, there will be an ability for the US to return to the table and to take over the lead again. And that will happen rather faster than slower. And it depends very much how effective the administration will work. And I'm pretty hopeful, given the choice of his team, that they will spring into action rather quicker than we saw that in the previous administrations.
James, how do you see that, both in whether there is a role here for Britain, new global Britain, another word we haven't even used, Britain post-EU Brexit, but also a sense of how can our friends in Europe and in Asia and around the world help the United States to come back where we need to go in the way that Stefan went.
I just want to pick up on just one point that Susan made about pardoning himself, the politics of the Biden administration as regards these acts post January the 20th. The one thing I'd be really concerned about is that the Biden administration makes a calculation over the right thing, that it chooses to say, look, We must live by the lofty rhetoric of bringing people together. We must avoid giving Trump the oxygen of publicity. What I really hope is that they do the right thing, that they pursue the rule of law, even if that does mean a long drawn out court case, even if that does mean these events are revisited. Because what we have seen in the rest of the world, Hungary and Viktor Orban are a good case in point, is the price you pay if they're not consequences. And that, I think, is really important. If you go back to your point about American exceptionalism, you have to see consequences. I just make 2 points. I think one is, we haven't touched upon the extent to which this is enormously damaging for the United States as regard racism, and just how visibly white that crowd was and how visibly different the treatment of it was from the treatment of the Black Lives Matter protesters post the killing of George Floyd. And the other thing is, don't underestimate the export of Trumpism and populism, particularly into Western Europe. I mean, Stefan, you're closer to it than me, but we're already looking at these stories about Proud Boys moving into Germany to see what they can do in advance of the German elections. We mustn't be naive about this. The argument you make about can you pick up, right? I don't think it's a sort of America's dropped the baton, can someone else pick it up? But I do think there is a reaffirmation of the principles of democracy. And it'll be interesting to see. There's a lot of talk at the moment in London about reconfiguring the G7 as the E10, the Democracy 10. And, for some people, they'll choke a little on that, given Boris Johnson's own reputation for the odd populist flourish. But actually reasserting those values is probably the best thing to do in answer to this. My overwhelming sense, Ivo, is that there are a lot of autocrats who are going to make hay out of this particular event. Those people who believe in the rule of law and the values of democracy should also make hay out of it, should also use Exhibit A for the reason the rule of law matters and the reason democracy matters. So I hope that actually, yes, there are things that London and the UK can do, and the D10 is not a bad start.
I think there is, it's not all about what the U.S. can do. It's what we have to do, be able to do together. I think there is a foundational piece to it in terms of the reestablishment of the rule of law, which is where we started off with. And American exceptionalism has been damaged greatly. It may be able to come back, but only if you act according to the values that are displayed there, and then do it in concert with your friends around the world. And that's why it is so important to put that center stage. This has been a rich and important discussion on a very tragic set of circumstances. I want to thank Susan Glasser, Stefan Cornelius, and James Harding for joining us today for this important discussion on world review. We'll be back next week, talk about the world's news. Maybe it'll be beyond what is happening in Washington and in the rest of the world. In the meantime, I wish all of you a very happy new year and a better new year for all of us, and a great weekend. Thank you so much for participating, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Ivo.